I don't know exactly when my son stopped calling me Dad. Maybe it was during a birthday I spent in silence, or when he graduated and looked into the crowd for a face that wasn't there. What I do know is that long ago he became a man who no longer recognizes me, and to be fair, I became a stranger to myself as well. The war didn't just take my friends, my sleep, or the ease of walking down the street without looking over my shoulder. It took the part of me that knew how to love clearly. When I came back, I carried medals in my pocket and guilt in my chest, thinking a restrained effort would be enough to start over. But I was just a shadow in the house, too hardened to talk, too wounded to show it, and too proud to ask for forgiveness. My son grew up watching me from a distance, like someone staring at a door that's always locked. And when he finally stopped trying to open it, I knew I had lost something time couldn't recover, something that might perhaps be reclaimed with courage. But I never had courage, only silence. Silence in the form of absence, swallowed apologies, and letters never sent. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 74 years old. I live alone in a small house with the sound of the clock and my own footsteps to remind me I'm still here. I retired decades ago, but only recently realized that work was, for a long time, my favorite escape. Waking up early, fixing things that didn't matter, answering in monosyllables, and spending the days waiting for bedtime. It's easy to hide behind routine when what you fear most is being seen. And even now, so many years later, when I look at the only photo of us together, me, my wife, and a boy with big, hopeful eyes, I feel a weight in my chest no war ever caused. Because in that frozen image lies everything I once had and let slip through my fingers. I never told my son I was proud of him. I never said it hurt to see him leave. I never said I loved him. And now, that silence has aged with me, so ingrained in my skin that it sometimes feels like I was born with it. But time has a curious way of surprising us, and sometimes, when you've stopped expecting anything, it returns what you thought was lost forever. Sometimes, it all starts with an envelope. The letter arrived on an ordinary morning, like most others since life slowed down for me. The sound of the mailman's tires didn't even catch my attention. Usually, it's just bills, ads, or veteran newsletters I flip through out of habit, not interest. But there was something different about that envelope. Not the sender, it had none, nor the handwriting, simple, direct, with letters slightly slanted to the left. It was a gut feeling. Something ancient inside me that woke up in that moment. My fingers trembled slightly before opening it, and when I read the name signed at the bottom, I had to sit down. It had been over 20 years since I'd seen those 7 letters together, aligned like a small sentence of life and absence. Daniel, my son. My son had written to me, and there in a few restrained words was what disarmed me most. An invitation. He was coming to town, just for a few days. He said he'd be staying at a nearby hotel, and that if I wanted, we could meet. He didn't write, "I miss you." He didn't mention the word "Dad," but he also didn't write with anger. There was no accusation, just space, an open, delicate, dangerous space. It was like standing before an unsteady bridge he had started building from his side, and now it was up to me to cross it. I sat there, letter in hand, for too long. I read and reread it as if part of me expected the words to change, the invitation to vanish, for it to be a mistake. But it wasn't. It was real. My son wanted to see me. After all this time, after all this silence. And that in itself scared me more than any explosion I'd faced in the field. I spent the rest of the day in silence. Not the comfortable silence that comes with the solitude of someone who's learned to live alone. It was a different kind, a heavy, restless silence, as if my own story was trying to break free from within me. I sat by the window, as my wife used to do in her final years, and watched the world outside as if searching for answers in birds, trees, or the wind. And maybe I found them. because when night fell and the house darkened around me, I knew I couldn't run anymore. Not again. I may have lost many things in life, time, presence, words, but there was one thing that could still be different, and even if I didn't know how, I wanted to try. I didn't sleep that night. I tossed in bed like a soldier about to go into battle, not out of fear of the enemy, but unsure if I still had the strength to lift the weapon. My mind unearthed images I tried to keep buried under thick layers of denial for years. Little Daniel running through the yard, the drawings he left on the fridge door, the last serious conversation we had before he left for college, and me, instead of wishing him luck or saying I was proud, just muttering, "Take care," with my eyes fixed on the TV. How many words did I leave unsaid? How many hugs did I deny myself out of fear of seeming weak, when in truth, that's exactly what I was. Too weak to handle the feelings the war had left raw, like nerves without skin. The next morning, I got up before the sun. I made coffee as always, too strong, too bitter, and put on a shirt I hadn't worn in ages, not out of vanity, but out of respect. For the first time in years, I felt something important was about to happen, and I couldn't meet my son wearing the same clothes as my silence. I left the house with short steps, as if afraid the ground might give way at any moment. The hotel was a few blocks away, and I walked. I wanted to feel the weight of the journey. I wanted each step to be a silent apology. When I arrived, I hesitated at the door. The receptionist looked at me kindly, and I simply said Daniel's name. He nodded and pointed to the small coffee lounge. My heart pounded with a force I hadn't felt since the days we awaited ambushes in the field, and then I saw him, sitting his back to me, a mug in his hands and a book in his lap. The same quiet, attentive demeanor he'd had since he was a child. I approached slowly. There was nothing between us now but time. And when he looked up, and our eyes met for the first time in so many years, the world didn't stop. But inside me, everything went quiet. He stood up, and in that moment, before any words were spoken, I knew nothing would be easy. But maybe it was still possible. There was no hug, not in that first moment. There was a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if we were 2 steps behind the courage for anything more. He said hi in a voice lower than I remembered, but with a steady tone that carried both restraint and presence. I replied with a hello that barely made it out of my throat, caught between old pride and recent regret. We sat at the same table, but with decades of distance between us. He held his mug with both hands, as if it were an anchor. And I just watched. His facial features were the same as those I'd once seen sleeping in the back seat of the car after a full day at the park. But now there were the marks of a man, of a path walked, of absence filled with his own strength. We started the conversation like 2 polite strangers. We talked about the weather, about travel, about coffee. Neither of us touched the words that really mattered, but I knew, and he knew, we were just skirting around what hurt. Sometimes the silence between one sentence and the next was longer than the conversation itself. But in that restrained space, there was something new, willingness. He didn't come to demand anything from me. He didn't throw accusations. He was just there. And that, to me, was as unexpected as the invitation itself. I wondered inwardly, what had brought him to me? A need to close cycles, a gesture of curiosity, or maybe a hope he himself couldn't name. As the conversation grew lighter, he asked if I wanted to walk a bit. I agreed, not for the exercise, but because there was something in that simple gesture that moved me. Walking beside my son, after all this time, was something I no longer dared to dream of. We walked without a clear direction, as if searching for a place where the right words could emerge. He talked about his work, how he enjoys living far from the big city, how he learned to cook for himself. And as I listened, I realized how many versions of him I'd missed, versions that grew up out of my sight, that matured without my support, and the guilt, that old companion, came like a shadow. But for the first time, instead of paralyzing me, it pushed me forward. I needed to do something different, even if it was just listening now, with my heart wide open, and that's what I did. For the first time, I listened to my son with my whole soul, without trying to justify the past, without seeking excuses, just present. And in that slow walk, still without declared forgiveness, still without resolved hugs, I began to understand. The reunion had already begun. And the mere fact that he was there, sharing the weight of his own story with me, was perhaps the first miracle. The walk led us to an empty park bench under the shade of an old tree whose name I couldn't recall. We sat side by side, our eyes looking in opposite directions, as if eye contact was still too intimate to sustain. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just the natural pause between a before and an after. I knew something was coming, and it did. He took a deep breath, rested his elbows on his knees, and stared at the ground for a few seconds before speaking. "You know what hurt the most?" he began, his voice steady but without anger. "It wasn't you leaving, because physically you were always there. It was that you never came back. That cut through me. Of all the things I'd rehearsed hearing, accusations, resentments, disappointments, that was the one that broke me most. Because it was true. I was home, but never present. I sat at the table, but never available. I was alive, but like a ghost. For years, I fooled myself into thinking my silence was self-protection, but it was cowardice. And my son, still a boy, learned to grow up in a home where affection was something you inferred, not expressed. He told me he used to ask about me when he was little and got responses like, "Your dad's tired," or "He had a rough day." And over time, he learned not to ask anymore. I listened to everything, without interrupting, without defending myself. Each of his words was a brick being removed from the wall I'd built between us. And it hurt, yes, but it was a necessary pain, because in the midst of that tough confession, there was a seed of hope. He still cared. He still wanted me to hear. And that in itself was a kind of forgiveness I hadn't expected. When I finally responded, I didn't prepare a speech. I just said what I'd carried for years but never managed to voice. "I failed you. Not as a soldier, but as a father. And if you're here, telling me this today, it's because maybe there's still something between us worth rebuilding." He didn't answer right away, but he also didn't get up. He stayed there, beside me, breathing deeply, like someone learning to share an old space with a new feeling. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity I'd never had. Forgiveness doesn't come with a magic word or a tearful hug. Forgiveness starts like this, with the decision to stay, even if it still hurts, even if something's still missing. In the days that followed, we didn't try to force any big conversations. We just stayed. We had lunch together in silence. We walked through the city with slow steps, each respecting the other's space. We were building something that didn't have a name, but had weight. The tension of the first day began to dissolve into small gestures. Him offering me some of what he was eating, me remembering how he took his coffee with too much sugar, him asking how my old knee was doing, the one that always ached on humid days. And that was more than any speech could offer. It was real life. Two men marked by time, by absence, by choices, now trying to find some kind of rhythm in the mess they'd left behind. There was one morning in particular that stood out. He brought me an album. He didn't say anything, he just placed it on the table and opened it. The photos were all of him. Childhood, adolescence, graduation, wedding. I wasn't in any of them. Each page turned was a reminder of how much I'd missed, But it was also a chance to look. And I looked, with attention, with pain, with regret, but also with gratitude for him letting me see. "You were always on the other side of the door," he said, his eyes fixed on a picture of him and his mother. "But I learned to live without knocking." And that's when I understood the strength of the man in front of me, not just for surviving my absence, but for being here now, showing me his wounds without making me bleed for them. That same afternoon, I prepared something simple for dinner: rice, meat, some vegetable. He complimented it, said it was like his mother's cooking. And I smiled, not out of pride, but because in that compliment was a piece of affection I hadn't expected to receive. Afterward, we washed the dishes together. And I can't explain why, but that moment, with water dripping from our hands and plates clinking, made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. For the first time in years, I saw myself in a family scene, not as a spectator, but as part of it. And I realized that the way back to someone you love isn't made with perfect speeches, but with presence, with consistency, with the simple act of not walking away. It was on an ordinary late afternoon, one of those when the light streams through the windows as if it wants to warm even the parts we hide, that I realized what was happening. My son was no longer just a presence in the house. He was part of it. The invisible tension between the rooms was gone, as was the excessive care with words. The routine had settled in an almost organic way. He helped himself to coffee, picked a corner of the living room to read, asked if I needed anything from the store, and sometimes just stayed there with me, in no hurry to leave. We weren't close in the traditional sense. We didn't share secrets or use affectionate nicknames. But there was a new kind of intimacy between us, the kind that builds when two people decide, without words, that they're done running from each other. One day, he asked me to visit the plot where his mother was buried. I hadn't been there in years, not out of disrespect, but because it still hurt. It hurt more than any war memory. I agreed. And when we got there, we stood in silence for a long time, just looking at the simple stone with her name. He crouched down, ran his fingers over the carved letters, and then looked at me. "She would have liked to see this," he said, without needing to explain what this was. And I nodded in agreement, because there in that silence by the edge of absence, we were both whole. For the first time, without demands, without resentment, without weight. Just two men facing a past that couldn't be changed, but that, in that moment, stopped dividing us. On the way back home, he asked if I'd ever thought about selling the place. And I said yes, many times. But in the last few days, something inside me told me to wait a little longer. He didn't reply, just smiled. And that smile gave me the answer I didn't know I wanted. He was considering me part of his now, and maybe of his later. With each passing day, it wasn't about apologizing anymore. It was about being present. It was about listening. It was about learning, at 74 years old, that it's never too late to be a father. And that loving a son doesn't depend on being perfect, but on being willing to let yourself be seen. And I, for the first time in decades, felt seen. And more than that, accepted. We started sharing time like someone learning a new language, hesitant at first, but with a care that little by little turns into fluency. Daniel began extending his stay one day at a time, and before I knew it, we'd been under the same roof for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't ask questions. Neither did he. It was as if we had a silent agreement. The past didn't need to be stirred up every day, as long as the present was tended to with respect. And it was. Our mornings took on simple rituals. I'd make coffee, he'd show up with 2 fresh rolls from the bakery, and the table, once always set for one, now had 2 places ready, as if it had always been that way. Little by little, he started fixing things around the house. He repaired the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for months, adjusted the back gate I'd been shoving with my knee, Bought a new light bulb for the guest room, which was no longer for a guest, but his. I watched these gestures like someone witnessing a small miracle without applause, but with misty eyes, because that was love. Not the loud love declared in movies, but the love of gestures that linger even when no one's watching. And I, who had lived so long feeling I didn't deserve love anymore, began to believe there was still room in me to receive it, and maybe to give it back. One Saturday, he invited me to lunch at a new restaurant in town I'd never heard of. I accepted. The waiter knew him by name, asked if I was his dad when he saw me. Daniel said yes, naturally, and I, for the first time in a long time, heard that word directed at me without pain. Just a good kind of strangeness, like rediscovering an old piece of life and finding it still fits. We talked about simple things, politics, music, movies, nothing deep. And yet, every exchanged sentence carried something bigger, a confirmation that we were finally in the same time, the same space, without the armor of the past. Two men learning to live side by side, not to recover what was, but to build what still could be. I never thought I'd find myself hoping my son would stay a little longer. My whole life, I was the man who waited for others to leave. Friends who fell in combat, colleagues who moved away, my wife, who one day fell asleep and didn't wake up. I was always the one waving from the porch, heart hardened and eyes dry. But now, every morning Daniel was still under my roof was a small victory over time, a small surrender on his part, and maybe a forgiveness that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. He started talking about the future as if it were natural for me to be there. "Next week we could watch that game together," he said one Sunday. "When you come visit, I'll take you to that park I mentioned." Small words, but inside me they echoed with the force of a new beginning. On that last night before he returned to the city where he lives, we sat on the porch. There were no stars, just the quiet darkness that blankets the fields when the world sleeps. He spoke little, I even less. But our silences were no longer walls, they were rest. When he stood to go to bed, he put his hand on my shoulder and said softly, "It was good being here, Dad." "It was good having you here, son," I replied, without effort, without pain, with truth. When he went up the stairs, I stayed there for a while longer. I didn't cry, I didn't need to, because there was a calm inside me I'd never known how to name until then. The feeling that, despite everything, love had found us. The next morning I walked him to his car. He hugged me for the first time since he came back. A real hug, firm, rooted. We didn't promise anything. We didn't swear to meet again. We just let the gesture say what time hadn't, and when. His car rounded the bend in the road, I realized the longing starting to form wasn't bitter anymore. It was a longing that came with a new certainty. I was no longer alone in the world. Today, I write this sitting on the same porch, but with a different gaze. I'm no longer just a war veteran. I'm a man who survived the greatest battle, facing the sun I once pushed away, and still being welcomed. I know the past doesn't change. I know I can't reclaim the birthdays, the graduations, the hugs. I didn't give, but I gained something more precious, the present, the time of now, and this I've chosen to live with him fully. Some reunions don't change the past. They don't erase the pain, replace lost time, or undo what was done. In silence. But sometimes, just sometimes, they save what can still be lived. Watching my son drive away that morning was different from all the goodbyes I'd lived through. There was no rupture, only continuity. An invisible thread now binds us, and it pulses with all we still have to build. Today, the days are lighter. The mornings have a different taste. I get messages, sometimes short, sometimes longer. "Good morning, Dad. Thought of you. Went back to that restaurant." And with each one, my chest responds. Not like a soldier on alert, but like a father finally at peace.